Researchers have found that a lot of children who were diagnosed with ADHD were actually children that were bored. They were very high intellectually. The work that they were receiving was just work they weren't interested in because they've already mastered it and they've moved on from it.
In our community, there's a lot of foods that I think are toxic. For example, a lot of children are eating diets that are rich or has a lot of sugar in it. The effects of sugar on a child can cause them to become hyper and even lose focus and whatnot. So that's one thing. I think another thing that people don't take into account that affects Black children is the trauma that a lot of us are facing and how that can affect behaviors and whatnot. I have a friend, he swears that his child did not become autistic until he received a certain vaccine. What's your take on that?
We really don't know the causation. We have risk factors. Vaccines have already proven.
Our next guest is a mental health practitioner with a specialty in working with children with autism and developmental disabilities. With years of experience in behavior therapy and counseling, he's here to show his insightful perspectives on psychology, autism, personal growth, and spirituality. Please welcome my guest, Lamont Gates.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much.
Yeah,
it's a pleasure to be here.
No doubt.
Absolute honor to come on Raw Success.
Yeah, man. Appreciate you, man. An honor to have you.
Thank you.
I want to get straight into it, man.
Yes, sir.
What causes autism?
Oh, well, you really did get straight into that one. So, first and foremost, let's describe what autism is. Autism spectrum disorder is characterized by a deficit in communication, socialization. A lot of times they have trouble with verbal communication, eye contact, socialization. They like to usually be alone by themselves, typically in their own world. They can't read social cues very well. Other characteristics of autism is repetitive motor and or stereotype behavior. Very often you will see a child rocking back and forth, swinging his hand, hitting his forehead. He or she is actually relieving a lot of tension. In our minds, when we look at that, we think that they're self-harming, but they're really not. So it's very interesting. Another characteristic is their inflexibility. For example, if I were to put 10 toys on the table, that kid will go back and pick the same toy most likely every single day, right? And when you try to get him or her to deviate to another toy, very often they'll be met with apprehension because they only want to play with that one toy. There's also sensory sensitivities. If I were to bring an autistic individual out to New York City, for example, where the hustle and bustle and horns are blaring and chants and music's playing, a lot of times they'll just cover their ears, right? Because they can't take it. It's overload of sensitivity, right? Overstimulation is what we call it. Now, to get back to your original question, what causes autism spectrum disorder? There is no known cause at this point. What we have are risk factors. For example, one risk factor could be the environment, the genetics, and social determinants. But there's no definitive causation to what it is that brings autism into an individual.
Social determinants?
Yes.
What does that mean?
So let me backtrack a little bit. So genetics, a risk factor possibly can be maybe the father had autism or the mother had autism and passed it to the child, perhaps. Environmentally, we know that drinking water with a lot of lead in it can cause developmental disabilities. Social determinants, meaning was the child active in a group? Were they social or are they kept alone? Because like I stated earlier, a lot of children on the spectrum only like to be alone, right? They like to be in their own world. As a matter of fact, the word autism comes from the Greek word auto, which means self. They're in their self world, right? Their own world. And they really have no awareness. They do have an awareness, but they really are indifferent to the environment around them. They're more concerned about their inner world, right? So that's a possible risk factor if the child has never really communicated or congregated with other children. But I can't say that that's causation, right? Because there's still nothing that we've discovered that actually causes autism.
Got it. Got it. Wow.
Hmm.
And why does it seem like there's more autistic boys versus girls?
Well, you got a point there. There doesn't seem to be. Actually, boys are 4 times more higher to be diagnosed with autism than girls. So 4 out of 1,000 boys would be diagnosed, whereas 1 out of 1,000 girls would be diagnosed. Let's talk about prevalence, actually, because I think that's what you're hitting at. Nationally, there is 1 in 36 children diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. State-wise, we are in the state of New Jersey. The ratio is 1 in 35. So nationally, 1 in 36, statewide, 1 in 35. There's really no significant difference there, as you can hear. Racially, there's a prevalence as well. According to the NIH, the National Institute of Health, Asian and Pacific children are diagnosed at a much higher rate than anyone else. As a matter of fact, I believe the statistic is 4.83. Following them are Hispanic children, 4.40. Following them are Black children, 4.17. And trailing all of them are white children at 3.89% of the population.
Interesting. I know there's no definitive cause, but based on your own research, your own independent research and observations, why do you think those statistics exist the way they do?
Very great question. So in the past, autism was mainly diagnosed in white children. And we believe that's the case is because there was a lot of affluency in those communities where they were able to get them to the doctors, right? They had medical insurance. They had the money to get them diagnosed early. Nowadays, especially in the state of New Jersey, it very much is a state that is stigma-free. It fights for the rights of people to get the proper mental health care that they need. So a lot of the minorities now are going and they're getting diagnosed. So they've pretty much caught up with the white community and actually surpassed them in diagnostics. A lot of schools are adopting behavioral therapy methods, right? They're seeing a lot of autism in their schools from the suburbs all the way into the inner cities. And those kids, they have child study teams and they're talking to parents and saying, listen, I think you should get your child evaluated. And, you know, even if you're underprivileged today financially, there's things such as Medicaid, right? You can take your child to a doctor, they can refer you to a neurologist, and boom, you can now get your child diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder, right? If you see the characteristics and the symptoms. So I just think there is a lot more concern and care, especially in the state of New Jersey, about children diagnosed with autism. And they want to make sure they want to get everyone properly diagnosed so they can get properly treated after diagnosis.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that about New Jersey because I have a son, my youngest son, who has some delays, some learning delays. And we were actually, like my wife and I and our family were actually planning to move to Florida. And what I'm about to say is no disrespect to Florida or anything like that, but we were told and like really like highly advised, like you need to stay in Jersey because Jersey has the best resources for situations like that. So it's interesting that you mentioned that. I'm actually going through that myself right now.
That is absolutely true. As a matter of fact, when you go back to the statistic that I mentioned, 1 in 35 children in New Jersey diagnosed, almost matching the national average. People have always wondered, my colleagues and I always wonder, why is it so many children in New Jersey diagnosed with autism? One hypothesis that we came up with is that a lot of people know about the services in Jersey. They know how much we care about the stigma-free communities and so on and so forth. So they moved out of a lot of their states and come to New Jersey simply for the services for their children. So, you know, that's very unfortunate. You talk about going to Florida and being told, you know what, there's not much help down there. So that's a plus for New Jersey, you know, minus how much we're being taxed here, but
No doubt.
But we are very serious about mental health in this state. And that's one thing that I'm proud of.
Okay. So I think you indirectly answered one of my other questions, but I'm going to ask anyway. So you and I are from the same generation. We actually went to kindergarten together. Isn't that crazy?
Yes, indeed.
Why does it seem like there's so many cases now opposed to back then? Are there more cases, or is it just awareness? Is there something going on with the food or the water? Like what's going on where it just seems like, for example, I mean, my memory of back then may not be the most accurate, but I really don't remember, you know, children having those types of issues back then.
Well, see, the thing about autism spectrum disorder is that it's actually on a spectrum. And so let's talk about what a spectrum is, and then I'll get right to that because it's going to tie into that. So a spectrum is basically the median between two extremities. I'll give you a perfect example. You look at a rainbow, you see a color on the top and a color on the bottom. In between, there are various other colors, right? That's a spectrum. Another perfect example of a spectrum is when you turn your kitchen sink on all the way to the right, you turn the nozzle to the right, you're going to get cold water. As you start slowly moving it to the middle, you're going to get warm, warm, lukewarm, warm, warm, very warm, hot once it goes right to the left. So autism spectrum disorder is the same way. There's kids with abilities that are high ranging. There's children with abilities that are not so high, right? So it's very possible that we ran into a lot of high range children back in the day, but we just didn't have a word for it. We just didn't have a diagnostics for it. We probably said, that person's a little strange because we didn't know anything about autism spectrum. Why is that person always, playing with themselves? Why are they only interested in that? And once we go back and start looking at some of the characteristics of the individuals we knew back then and start matching them to autism, we might see something. Also, back then, we had a name for children that were kind of lower on the spectrum. We called it retardation. We don't use that word anymore, by the way, mental retardation, right? Today, those children may be looked at as someone who was lower on the autism spectrum. So perhaps it was there. We just didn't recognize it because it's such a spectrum,
Ah, got it. And why does it seem, and I may have some, I'm going to say labels for lack of a better word. I may have it improper, right? Wrong labels. It seems like some people who are on the spectrum have other abilities or gifts.
Yes, correct. They're called splinter skills. So there are children who, and I've worked with several of these kids, it's amazing. They have trouble with socialization. They have trouble with communication, both verbally and written at times, but sit them down at a piano. They'll play any Ray Charles song that's ever been recorded. Give them a piece of paper, a canvas with paintings. They'll paint like Picasso. It's amazing. And I want to go backwards and talk about exactly what autism spectrum disorder is. From a diagnostic perspective, it's a neurological / developmental disability. So there's a part of the brain that's separated from the other parts of the brain. And researchers are saying that they believe that splinter skills are somehow in those sections of the brain that's expansive, more expansive than, somebody who's neurotypical. Another word for children on the spectrum is neurodivergent. So some of these neurodivergent kids, really, they do have some great gifts, as you said. We call them splinter skills. They may not be able to tie their shoes, but they could probably quote, right out of the Bible or right out of the Quran or play, like I said, play a violin piece just as good as, anyone playing a Mozart piece who graduated from some doctorate's program in a music program.
So when you say the brain, right? Because the brain, you said the brain is divided, split.
So not the actual brain is not split, but there's certain sections of the brain that are highlighted, right? That may allow them to have these splinter skills, that may allow them to tap into certain skills that a neurotypical kid would not.
Right. Is it because of like the connections, like the electrical synaptic connections?
It's, we're still trying to understand it because not every kid, obviously, on the spectrum has splinter skills. As a matter of fact, there's a smaller percentage of kids on the spectrum that have splinter skills. But when you see them, it's just amazing. And it does have something to do with certain sections of the brain.
Yeah. What do you think about Dr. Umar Johnson when he mentions, before I asked that question, there's other labels. There's autism, there's ADHD. I don't know them all, but there's other different types of labels, right? Can you specify what the differences are of some of these typical well-known labels or prevalent labels?
Yeah. So ADHD, in the diagnostic manual today called the DSM, which is a book that was created by several psychiatrists to help mental health professionals target and diagnose accurately some of these disabilities. So ADHD is actually two things in one. The first portion of it is ADD, which used to be called ADD, which is an attention deficit disorder. The second portion of it is called hyperactivity disorder. So with ADD, with the attention deficit disorder portion, the child has a very short attention span. For example, you can be standing up in the classroom with 20 children. He or she could be one of 20 children, and you could be teaching them something simple as 1 + 1. And when you come to that kid, you'll see that they're probably looking at the window or probably didn't hear what you said because they have a hard time concentrating. That's what ADD is. Hyperactivity disorder, they have a hard time sitting down. They're very fidgety. Sometimes they blurt out answers before you can get to them, and they just have a hard time controlling themselves. There's a high level of impulsivity. Usually with both of those, especially the hyperactivity section, doctors and neurologists usually prescribe children Adderall, right? It helps them calm down. In addition to that, there are behavioral therapy services that can help both children, but it depends on the severity level of it, right? So if it's not so severe, you can probably just use behavioral therapy. If it's very severe, you probably want to combine it with medication and behavioral therapy. That's called a biosocial model.
So great. I'm glad you broke all of those down. What do you think about stuff like, for example, Dr. Umar Johnson, right? He talks about how a lot of Black boys are mislabeled and how these labels affect them in their future journey or academic process, or even until adults, and that these labels can impact them in a negative way. I'm not quoting him, right? Because that's not an exact quote, but that's my interpretation of some of the stuff that he says. And he even has a book where he talks about this. What do you think about that? Hold that real quick. I agree with what he says because of a few things, right? So I'll give you my thoughts so you can express your perspective on both of them. Number one, in our community, there's a lot of foods that I think are toxic that a lot of children are eating. For example, a lot of children are eating diets that are rich or has a lot of sugar in it. And we all know what sugar is, a drug. And the effects of sugar on a child, right, can cause them to become hyper and even lose focus and whatnot. So that's one thing. I think another thing that people don't take into account that affects Black children is the trauma that a lot of us from certain communities, and you and I come from that community, are facing, and how that can affect behaviors and whatnot. I think if I was born or was a child in this generation, so to speak, I think I probably would have got labeled, because I remember being in class, not being able to focus and also acting up and whatnot. And the other thing that I think is an issue with certain labels is that they're not taking into account of the different ways that many of us learn. So there's kinesthetic, as you know, there's visual learners. So let's say you have a child that's a kinesthetic learner, but he's forced to sit in a classroom, listen to a classroom with 30, 35. Remember, you and I went to school where there was 35 children in the classroom, right? From different, right? He's forced to sit down, listen to this teacher lecture about a boring subject, right? And so I think that it does get a little hazy when you take, and I can go on about the different examples. It gets a little hazy when you have all of these other elements involved, and now you're labeling children. So what do you think about all of that?
That is a lot to chew on. When it comes to Dr. Umar Johnson, I would have to hear the exact labels that he's actually referring to. I know we're talking specifically about autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. Not really sure what labels he was referring to, but it sounds like what you were talking about with the foods, and the social determinants, as I spoke about earlier. Sounds like you're hitting on some of those potential risk factors, right?
Different learning methods.
We don't know what the causation of ASD is, but there are risk factors that we need to start paying attention to. And I think you brought some of that up.
ASD? That's a different term.
ASD is autism spectrum disorder.
Oh, got it.
Yes. As for ADHD and sugar, so the thing about ADHD is it's a very tricky thing to diagnose because it's purely observational, right? You're just observing the child's behavior. And again, the DSM breaks down how long the child has to be behaving this certain way before you can diagnose them with ADHD. It's not like a blood test where you can look at the test and see someone's blood pressure is 130/80 or the sugar is 90, or 80 or 100. So there has been a lot of pushback on whether or not some of these kids should be labeled ADHD. For example, and I think you hit this point correctly, I've read research on this when I was studying for my master's degree in child and adolescent developmental psychology, is that researchers have found that a lot of children who were diagnosed with ADHD, were actually children that were bored, right? They were very high intellectually. And the work that they were receiving was just work they weren't interested in because they've already mastered it and they've moved on from it. So we have to really determine whether or not the child is bored or if the child actually is hyperactive or if the child actually does have an attention deficit, right? And there's different ways to test that. We can give them higher levels of learning, right? If we already know that they mastered their times tables, let's see if they're interested and they could solve some higher learning issues. But yes, that's definitely a concept in psychology research on whether or not ADHD is a proper term for every child.
Yeah, I mean, I can even tell you from my own personal experience, when I went to Eastside, bro, I was in, and I don't know if this terminology is considered appropriate or not, but I was in the slow classes. Like, as you know what I mean? Like, they put me in the slow classes. And so, but when I went to college, I graduated high honors, right? Top 10 of my class, all of that. And so the reason why I'm bringing that up, because I discovered that what happened was I just didn't want to do the work in high school, basically. I just didn't want to do it. And when I went to college, there was, number one, there was a purpose, right? Like for me, college was about like, I need to transform my situation. I want to stop doing what I'm doing in the streets. And I want to get a career. I had a child. So there was meaning. There was purposeful. Mm-hmm. And there was the whole, I wanted to prove a point because, I was a felon, because I come from a certain background. I wanted to show these people in college that we have the ability to succeed and to be academically supreme if we choose to. Mm-hmm. So I was like, just putting that, right, using me as an example on how, like, just the individual, there's such an important factor that has to be considered as far as the individual is concerned. Because again, I feel like if this was back in the day, if this was now, I definitely would have gotten like labeled or something like that. And that wasn't the case. The case was pretty much I was being lazy. I didn't want to do the work.
And the main difference between high school and college is that you can choose your major. You can choose a lot of the classes you want to learn. So there's an interest there. Whereas high school, they're just shoving history, social studies, and math, and the same regurgitated material down your throat.
Indeed.
Yes.
You mentioned Adderall, right? Mm-hmm. First, for our listeners, what is Adderall and what's the effect on Adderall?
So Adderall is a medication typically used for children who are hyperactive. The purpose for taking Adderall is to kind of calm the hyperactivity down, right? So that they're not as hyperactive, so that when they go to school, they can stay seated. They can stop blurting out answers. Remember, those are characteristics of hyperactivity disorder. It helps them not be as impulsive. I don't suggest medication only. I actually first suggest non-medication. Let's see what behavioral therapy can do, right? Before we start pumping medication in children. But there are times when behavioral therapy is not enough. The kid is literally running down the street naked, So you want to bring them to a neurologist, and it's a group thing. Everyone is a stakeholder in the child's well-being, right? The parent, the teacher, the behavioral therapist, the neurologist. Everyone needs to come to the table and really try to figure out a plan for this child. So is medication the best route? Is behavioral therapy the best route? Or should we combine them, right? It really depends on the severity level. But in a nutshell, that's what Adderall is. It's to help calm the behavior of the child down so that they're more attentive and they can actually sit and not be as impulsive and hyperactive.
Two things I want to mention. First thing, I hear rappers now, especially the young rappers, they talk about using Adderall in their rhymes. So what happens when somebody who doesn't have those issues uses the drug? What effect does it have?
You're going to have a difficult time getting out of bed. And believe me, I've seen kids that were actually put it this way. I've seen kids who've had a higher dosage than they need. A lot of the times they came to the classroom with their head down. So if you don't need this, you can imagine what that can do to you. As I said, you're going to have a difficult time getting out of bed. And if you're a rapper and you got a show to do, you probably shouldn't be doing Adderall if you don't need it.
What would be, and probably a rapper who uses it I should need to ask them that question. But I'm just wondering, like, what would be the positive effect of using Adderall if you don't really need it? Especially like you said, like you won't be able to get out of bed. Maybe just a relaxation, maybe for...
You're right. You probably have to ask them, but I think they're probably using it recreationally as someone would use marijuana.
Right. I'm glad you said that because the second thing I was going to say, growing up, a lot of us experimented with marijuana and whatnot. However, I definitely have noticed and can remember how some people were almost using it to really like self-medicate. And so I'm wondering, back to what you were saying about some of the lack of awareness, how maybe an individual probably knew that they were hyperactive, they couldn't control it. And when they smoked weed, they're like, oh, I feel normal now. Normal, I put that in quotations. Or maybe I don't have the same sensitivity issues or whatnot because they calmed themselves down. We know weed has a tendency to be a calmer.
Right.
So it's interesting that you mentioned that.
Yeah.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. And there has been some grassroots studies actually with marijuana and autism. There have been ideas by researchers who believe that because marijuana is a natural stimulant, is a natural plant, that it may have some positive effects on some of the characteristics of autism and ADHD, by the way. So if the kid is jumping out of his seat, running around, certain marijuana plants could probably replace Adderall because it's a natural plant to actually be used as a safer method of, calming the individual down rather than giving them something that's going to give them other side effects.
Yeah. What should a parent be looking for if they're concerned about their child's development in terms of autism, ADHD, and some of the other labels? Is there something that is there something that a parent should be be aware of?
Yeah, great question.
Because you think like I had my first child at 19.
Right.
I didn't know any of this stuff.
You're a child yourself.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what should the parent be looking for? What should they do?
So children are typically diagnosed with ASD as early as age 2. What you want to look at is at age 1 is the child walking on time. You also want to look at age 2 is the child talking on time. So these are telltale signs. Another thing you want to look at is the temperament of the child. Are they constantly crying? Do they always seem angry? Do they always seem impulsive? Right? Because if that gets older and it gets untreated, then, you're really going to have some issues by the time the child turns 13. So they should be looking at that as young as 1, as young as age 2. Here's the problem, though. Sometimes at age 2 and 3, children are talking, right? Children who are later diagnosed with ASD, they're talking, they're walking. All of a sudden at age 4 or 5, they lose their communication, right? And the parents are like, well, what's going on? I don't understand. He was talking perfectly at age 2 and 3. Now all of a sudden, he went from, 5 words to 10 words. Now he's going back to 3 words. That's also something you want to look for. If your child lost communication, right? You want to take them right to the neurologist at that point in time and say, listen, he had speech. Now he's losing speech. Or you can say he's not developing speech on time. So early detection is the best. Other than that, you're still going to see characteristics, even if they go past the age of 3 and 4. So age 5, age 6, remember I said there's deficits in communication, there's deficits in socialization, right? Eye contact, a lot of times they can't utilize that correctly. They may have inflexible or routine play routines, right? They'll play with the same toy over and over. And when you try to deviate them to something else, they have no interest. They may not have an interest in other children, even if the children invite them over to play. So these are things you want to look at because they're not typical developments.
What's up with the eye contact thing?
So eye contact, a lot of times children, when they're very young, they'll look at you right in the eyes, right? Especially if you put your face right in front of them. A lot of times children on the spectrum won't look at you. It's like they don't even recognize that you're there. Mm-hmm. So you want to pay attention to that as well. That in addition to other things, right? And it's usually not just one thing you want to look at. You want to look for several characteristics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, and so what should a parent do?
So if a parent is seeing these things, what they want to do is they probably want to go to their GP, right? Their general practitioner who may refer them over to a neurologist, or they can go right to a neurologist, and the neurologist will do an evaluation and they will give a diagnosis and determine if the child is on the spectrum or not. And earlier is best because the earlier you diagnose the child, the earlier you can start services, whether it be behavioral therapy, modified education in schools, etc.
I have a friend, right, who has an autistic child, and he swears that his child did not become autistic until he received a certain vaccine. Now, the child is in his 20s at this point, so we're not talking about any of the recent vaccines.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that? Is that something that you heard before? What's your take on that?
Very good question. Yes, of course. Anybody who works in the autism field, we've definitely heard the theory, or what we call conspiracy theory, of vaccines causing autism. I will say that in the year 2014, the American Academy of Pediatrics conducted a meta-analysis study of 1.25 million children who were recipients of the MMR vaccine, which is measles, mumps, and rubella. And they determined, the results were classified, that none of these children had any connection with the vaccine and autism spectrum disorder, because ultimately, when the children took the vaccines, they did not have any characteristics of autism, and none of them were diagnosed with autism. So again, as I stated at the top of the show, we really don't know the causation. We have risk factors. Vaccines have already proven not to be one of them. But, you may have a hard time convincing everyone out there about that.
Okay. What are some of the behavior therapy or counseling? What are some of the practices that you do
to manage autism spectrum disorder? So there is a great behavioral therapy called applied behavior analysis, and that's where I come in. We call it ABA for short. I've been working in the ABA field for, I want to say, since 2015 now, and I started out in the school systems. Usually you'll get a board certified behavioral analyst, and then you'll have behavioral therapists under them. And what ABA is it helps to modify maladaptive or aberrant behavior. In addition to that, it brings out skills that the parents probably thought the child didn't have. So it's skill acquisition and a behavioral modification. So if a child has trouble sitting down, right, there are behavioral therapies that can help the child stay seated and focus. If the child has been assumed to not be mathematically inclined, we can actually test that and, usually break down the classroom. Instead of having 20, 25 children in, you get a smaller classroom so that the kid can focus more. And, you would put those types of skill acquisitions in front of the child. ABA is very thorough. There's a lot of data collection involved, and a lot of graphing so that you can see the progress of the child. And once the child has progressed, you move right to the next stage. What you're doing is you're targeting maladaptive behaviors that both the parent and the teachers are having trouble with dealing with the child with. ABA is a specialized type of therapy that kind of focuses solely on those things and helps to modify them. Whereas a classroom teacher is just there to teach the children English, math as a whole. ABA is usually for the individual child, and it usually breaks down and helps to modify behavior and build that skill acquisition by usually breaking down curriculums into smaller portions until you finally can get the full portion of the curriculum.
Got it. Yeah, man. It's super dope, man, to see you as an expert on this subject and all of the great work that you're doing, especially because I've known you since kindergarten.
Yes, sir.
So it's just amazing. And I want to ask you 2 questions based on the relationship that you and I have.
Sure.
The first one is, we're both from Patterson, right? And it's unfortunate for me to say, but a lot of the people that we grew up with, including myself, we all went to the streets after a certain age, and at a very young age at that. What is it about you? Or tell me how, how did you dodge the street element that many of us got into? You've always been different. You've always been very unique in how you carried yourself. And I really want to salute you for that, bro, because for me, that's a leadership quality. You never seem to be the type of person that follows. You're not a follower. You have always been yourself, very unique. And so tell us about that. You
Sure.
being yourself, being unique, how you managed to escape the trap, as they call it, right? And then how you got into this field specifically.
I thank you for that, and I thank you for recognizing, your own appreciation. I'm very appreciative of that as well. And yes, we grew up together. It's been a long ride since kindergarten. I want to say 1985, 86.
Yep,
right?
I got the picture and everything.
And we still kept in touch with one another. Great question you ask. So because I've studied developmental psychology, I probably would have answered this question much differently prior to studying it. But when I was introduced to developmental psychology, there was a very simple formula that we learned about in a Lifespan's development textbook. And the formula was E times G. And that simply means environment in combination with genetics. Now, if I could rewrite that textbook, I would add a P in there. So it would be E times P times G, and that will be environment, psyche / perspective or perception, and genetics. So genetically speaking, if you put me on a scale between introvert and extrovert, I fall towards the introvert, right? That's my temperament. If I look back at my father, I notice he's the same way, right? So that's a temperament that's passed down genetically. And if you know anything about an introvert, we like being to ourselves very often. And that's exactly how I was as a child. I loved being left to my own devices. One of the things I loved was music appreciation. As a child, I would throw headphones on my ears and just listen to all types of music, right? I'm still that way today. So that kind of kept me indoors and off the streets, right? Because I always had something to do inside in my own world. My environment, my mother was a single parent. I was the only child, and so she kept her eyes on me 100%, right? She cared about me like, as she should, right? Because I was her only child at the time. So she set a lot of values and rules upon me that, I listened to, right? Because I didn't have another, that was my parent. In addition to that, my environment was, I grew up in the 5th Ward of Patterson. So did you. Predominantly Hispanic community. And I will say something about that community. They, you know, they went to school for the most part. They went to school, they graduated. Once they graduated, they went right to work. In the meantime, while they were young, we were always outside. And you have to remember, this is way before the advent of the internet and people holding smartphones. We were constantly outside playing basketball, baseball, football, pro wrestling, you name it. That's what we did. So I owe a lot to that community because, again, now the P comes, right? The psyche, the perception, right? My perception of that community and everything that I was involved with is that you work hard, you go to school, you graduate, you get a job, right? So E times P times G, when you put all those things together, I think that's what pretty much kept me out of the street. My introversion, right? Kept keeping myself busy indoors. My mother's values and the children I played with, the small circle of friends I had, none of them did drugs. They all went to school. If they didn't go to college, some of them went to the military, right? And I really credit the Hispanic community in the Fifth Ward for the man who I am today.
Wow.
I was born on the other side of Patterson now, the Fourth Ward, when I was a kid. That's a totally different community, right? Predominantly black community. And as you and I know, unfortunately, there's a subculture there where our young black men, are not as unified as that Hispanic community was in the Fifth Ward. A lot of times it will be block versus block. It'll be high school versus high school. It'll be projects versus projects within the projects. This building fighting that building, so it was just a different mentality where I grew up.
Yeah.
I guess you could say.
Yeah. I just want to say, in addition to what you just mentioned, you also grew up in what was called Triangle Village, right? Which I didn't live there. I would go visit you and some other people. And I think that socially and what's the word for finances? Like
socioeconomic status. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes. So I think that the socioeconomics of the people in the Triangle Village community were also different. And I want to say this because just on my my values, that we are not saying, well, I can't speak for you. I'm going to speak for myself. I don't think that it has anything to do, let's say, with black or Hispanic. And I want to be clear that there are black Hispanics also. I am one of them. But we are talking about a people that come from a certain culture, background, whether it's Dominican, Puerto Rican, and Peruvian, and so forth, right? So I don't like to create that divide because I think that divide already causes issues in places where we come from, right? That's number one. Number two, I don't think, and I can't, this is your life and you're speaking on your life. I don't think the Hispanic culture played so much of a role. I think that what plays a major role is the socioeconomic aspect. Now, I understand what you mean, right? A lot of Hispanics are known for being family oriented and whatnot. And we have to include, and this is for our viewers, because I think there's some people who may listen with prejudices, right? To say, oh, see, even he's saying that black people are bad. Hispanics are better.
I said subculture. I didn't say black people in general. There's a subculture in certain communities, put it that way.
Yeah, indeed. And so a lot of, again, right, including myself, my mother came from a third world country. A lot of the families that you grew up with, I know them personally. Their parents came from a different country and brought some of those values and whatnot here, right? So, and then you have, I'm going to say black people. Again, there are black Hispanics out there, but non-Spanish speaking black people,
right,
who have been here for hundreds of years and were victims of crack cocaine, destroying the community, poverty, a lot of unequal employment. And it's 2024 now, and I know things have changed, but we're talking about the byproduct of a whole lot of things. So I just wanted to add that on and ask, what do you think about those things that I'm adding on to the conversation?
Well, you mentioned socioeconomic status. So the socioeconomic status it's the Martin de Porres village. Triangle Village wasn't far though. It was down the street on Prince Street.
I apologize about that. That's right. Yeah, my fault.
Yeah.
That's right. That's right.
That's all right.
The village part threw me off.
Yeah. So we were actually middle to lower middle class, right? I wouldn't say we were wealthy in the Martin de Porres village. As a matter of fact, that village, the way you got into that village was based on your income, right? So if your income was low, you paid low rent. If your income was a little higher, you paid a little higher rent. So it was based on your income. So socioeconomic status, yeah, I mean, we weren't really wealthy. Again, people worked hard. They did. They worked hard. They went to work because a lot of them had multiple children. My mother was one who had one child, and that was me. But I grew up with a lot of kids who had, brothers, sisters. So the parents went to work and they worked hard to give their children, simple things like a roof over their head and food on the table. I just think the culture, and it just could have been in the Fifth Ward, in that particular area. I think that culture was just very tight knit. They always had something to do. Now, that doesn't mean none of the children in the Fifth Ward, ever got in trouble, because we've seen that. We've seen some kids get caught up in drugs. We've seen some kids go to prison. But the ones in my circle, in particularly, they never really got caught up with drugs. I guess you could say that I was attracted to those that were like me, if that makes any sense, right? So I held them in my circle, and I rubbed off on them. I think they rubbed off on me, and here I am. I just didn't get caught up, just like they didn't get caught up in the streets. So we were talking earlier off the microphone. Some of them became police officers themselves, right? And never had a criminal record themselves. Some of them have moved out of the state and they're doing very well themselves. These are the same people that were in my circle, right? I can't even say that I have a lot of friends who went to prison, to be honest with you, in that group.
Yeah.
So
it says a lot about the power which, they say birds of a feather
flock together. Correct.
Right.
Yes.
So there's these sayings with wisdom, right?
Yes.
And I want to highlight that, especially for our young people, who are just starting their journey in life. When they talk about, show me your five of your friends and I'll show you who you are. Birds of a feather flock together. When your parents talk about, be mindful of the people you associate with. This is a byproduct of that, and so it just really shows and proves that it's important about being mindful of who you surround yourself with.
And when you say mindful, again, it goes back to that formula. E, the environment I was in. P, my perception of the environment. And G, genetics, right? Your temperament. Some people are extroverted, some people are introverted. That doesn't determine whether you get in trouble or not. Extroverts may be more outgoing, introverts may be more ingoing. But, when you combine everything, it could sort of take you on a particular pathway.
So how did you get into this field?
Yes. So when I graduated William Patterson, I originally went to school for communications, radio and television communications. I soon realized that upon graduation, there are no jobs out there. So I needed to find work. I started substitute teaching in the city of Patterson, and I realized, I like these kids. They were asking me a bunch of questions. I was answering them, and they were very, excited to see this new face in their classroom. So I went from there, and I started working in schools in Bergen County, in their special education programs. I was then introduced to an ABA program, as we talked about earlier, applied behavior analysis, and classrooms that mainly dealt with children who were on the spectrum and, other developmental disabilities. Shortly after that, I was introduced to an ABA agency, which allowed me to go in-home and work with children on the spectrum doing ABA therapy. And from there, I worked for ABA centers, which is more intensive ABA therapy. It's 8 hours a day. You bring these children in, and we're only focusing on behavior modification and skill acquisition, right? Once we finish with that in the center, those kids go to regular school, and hopefully they're educated in a bigger classroom, like the neurotypical kids. Not long after that, I got a job with Bergen County government and their Department of Human Services, Division of Family Guidance. My civil service title there is Youth Services Counselor. That's where I'm working at currently. And there I run and help facilitate a social skills program for children ages 7 to 12 with a focus on psychoeducation with a curriculum based around social-emotional learning.
Hey, you've mentioned some of these, you mentioned social and psychology.
Mm-hmm.
There seems to be a clash within these systems, right? You have social work, you psychologists, psychiatrists, right?
Yep.
What do you think about that? The for lack of a better word, I'm not in the field. I'm going to say philosophical clashes.
Yes. There are there's psychologists, there are social workers within the school system. There are teachers, obviously. There's behavioral therapists. There are occupational therapists, and I've seen clashes, especially between the behavior therapists and the occupational therapists. Occupational therapy is a very sensory-based type of therapy, whereas behavior therapy is a very external, right, behavioral observation type of therapy. And very often they clash. I remember one time there was a student who he was displaying some symptoms of hyperactivity disability, as we talked about earlier. And the occupational therapist just wanted to put a weighted vest on the kid, right, to sit him down. The BCBA is like, no, what do we need that for? That's you're just, it's like putting it on a dummy. It's not going to do anything for the child. So there was a clash there. I think a lot of these clashes that we see in these helping professions, unfortunately, come down to one word, and that's ego, right? Everybody has an ego. Everyone wants to be right. Everybody has a particular philosophy, and they think that philosophy is the only philosophy that works. I am more interested in unifying all of these fields. And in many cases, we do see that, right? Because we're stronger together rather than separated. So if we have a child who needs behavioral therapy, in addition to a child who has sensory issues, in addition to a child who may need some other innate mental disability, mental health care, combining these fields and combining these disciplines is what we need rather than the ego and the schisms.
Got it.
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to highlight something. You mentioned unifying these systems, for lack of a better word, right? And I noticed something about you. You unified your love for radio and your love for the service, for working with the children now, because you also have your own podcast.
Right.
And I want to get into that. Before we do, I want to ask you now, this is the same question, but I want you to answer it from two different perspectives. What has been your biggest challenge in life, right? And how did you overcome that? And then what has been the biggest challenge in your field?
Okay, so I think in life, I think the biggest challenge is when you're young, you really can't predict the future. You don't know what's out there. The big unknown, I guess, that was always challenging. Wondering, what am I going to be in life? And I like, what? A lot of times we don't know where our skills are, until we get older and more mature and get out there and start utilizing it. But, the great unknown, I remember in high school thinking to myself, well, I got a plan. I'm going to be this, this, and this. And once I saw that not really materializing by the time I got into my undergraduate school, I'm like, whoa, what else is out there? So the fact that I even got into this field, coming from communications, radio and television, I should have been in Hollywood right now, but I'm not. I'm in a helping profession. So that's a hurdle I eventually got over. But I think my biggest challenge in life was fearing the unknown, I guess, if you want to say that.
Before you answer the next one, did you have thoughts at the time like, man, I invested all this time and resources in this major, and now I have to pivot? So some people, I know you mentioned a job, so maybe you were forced to, but I find that I meet some people who are miserable doing what they're doing, but they feel like, yo, I put all this time in.
Yeah.
So they want to pivot, but they don't. So how were you able to successfully pivot?
That's a great question. I do remember being an undergraduate, and while I was going through my radio and television communication courses, I had what's called free elective courses that I had a choice in taking, right? They had nothing to do with my core courses. And I realized something. When I was taking these elective courses, they were all helping professions. Social problems class, marriage and family class, racism and sexism in United States institutions, Islam in United States institutions. I loved sociology. I loved psychology and on the undergraduate level. And I realized something about myself. I said, you know what? There's a secondary interest in me. But all I could see was the glitz and glamour, right? All I could see was Hollywood. And that's what I was aiming for. Thankfully, though, I did have that secondary backup to say, wait a minute, you know what? I do have an interest in these things. And those particular jobs were, much more realistic for me to get. And so I guess that's what drove me here as well.
Got it.
Now, to your second question, which was, what's my biggest challenge in the field? I would say working with children on the spectrum can be extremely taxing. I remember days when we would work with a particular student who was very aggressive, physically aggressive, not only towards themselves, but towards anybody. So we would finally get that kid calm. 5 minutes later, they back up attacking you. We get them calm again. 5 minutes later, they're back up attacking you. And one of the issues was that the parents really didn't believe in medication. Remember, I talked earlier about Adderall. They didn't believe in any types of medication. So that made it really difficult for them at home, made it really difficult for the child, and made it really difficult for us to educate that child because they didn't have that biosocial component that I talked about earlier. They only wanted the social component. They said, we're sending this child to school, you fix it, but there was a severity there. And I've dealt with a lot of children like that, not all of them, but it's very taxing, working with some of the behaviors. In addition to that, some of the adults can be taxing, right? Again, we talked about philosophical clashes. Everything could be working fine. Someone with an ego may come in and say, no, do it this way, and just totally disrupts the whole process. So, and I was taught, take a slice of humble pie, let them speak their thoughts and just continue on, right? Because to go back and forth with someone, to me, is very unprofessional, but at the end of the day, it's a lack of self-awareness on their part, right? And the unifying aspect of the field, I think, is something that it's hard for a lot of people to grasp because the ego gets in the way, right? Because my philosophy is greater than yours gets in the way. So those are some two challenges, I think, that's been very taxing and challenging in this field. But you know what? When I look back at them, I'm glad I went through them because not only did I overcome them, I learned what I can do better the next time I'm faced with that same challenge.
What would you say is the secret to your success overall in life, in business, and so forth?
I would say the secret to my success in any of these fields that I've been in is to stay persistent, right? Know your craft. You may have graduated college, but there's still a lot to learn because research always updates, right? There's always something newer to learn. Stay on top of your craft. Be very open-minded to the diversities of the clientele that you're working with, right? I think a very important thing in this field is cultural competency, right? That can get in the way because you got to understand when you're doing a helping profession, you're working with everybody from all walks of life, religiously, racially, sexual orientation, etc. Right? Being open-minded to your diverse clientele, and just giving everything your all, right? But not too much of yourself that you're maxed out and can't give to someone else.
What message do you have for young people who are just starting their lives out?
I would say, don't put all your eggs in one basket, as I believe I did. Again, I studied radio and television communications thinking that this is it. Always pay attention to those things that you're interested in, but are not necessarily at the forefront, because that just may be what you're going to end up doing in your life, right? Always pay attention to all your interests, and don't put all your eggs in one basket. There's a plethora of things you can probably do in the world. A lot of times we hear kids who audition for shows or whatever. They're like, "This is the only thing I can do. If I can't do this, I can't live." That's pure nonsense. There's always something out there you can do. Never sell yourself short, and just keep your options open.
There's a saying right now amongst like entrepreneurs and whatnot, where they say no plan Bs, only plan A, and don't stop until you arrive. What would you say to that?
Well, what happens when you never arrive? That would be my question to the entrepreneur. What do you do then? Do you stop trying to take care of your family? Do you stop trying to taking care of yourself, or are you forced into a plan B?
Right.
I was, because what I had planned out in this document, obviously that wasn't the reality, right? It just wasn't going to happen. It wasn't where I was headed. Thankfully, I had that secondary interest in the helping professions that, I didn't really pay attention to, but it was kind of forced to be pushed to the forefront. So I would ask the question to those entrepreneurs: what happens when that plan A fizzles out?
Yeah. I appreciate you as a man because you could have been, a man in his 40s living in his mom's, sleeping on his mom's couch, talking about your radio personality. But instead, you did what you had to do as a man and shifted and pivoted, so to speak. So I definitely get that. So let's speak about the first interest that you had. You have a podcast.
Yes, I do. Yes.
First, let the people know what your podcast is and what it's about.
So the podcast is called Real Spiritual Talk Radio. It is a first-hand interview accounts of people who had near-death experiences. And let me break down what a near-death experience is for you. A near-death experience is an experience typically at the point of clinical death, right? A person may have a heart attack and they're rushed to the hospital, or maybe not even rushed to the hospital, but they are clinically dead. There's no heartbeat. There's no breathing. There's brainwave cessation, right? The brain waves have stopped. Very often, these people will talk about leaving their physical body, right? Either their consciousness or their thoughts, their mind would literally come out of their physical body, and they will be in the same earthly environment where their physical body is looking down upon it, watching the doctors trying to resuscitate them. Very often, they would then move out of this out-of-body environment and go into what we call a transmaterial realm. Typically, it's a tunnel. They're moving fast through this dark tunnel. Ahead of them is a small pinprick of light. Eventually, that light becomes massive, and they go right into this light, and they're just surrounded and engulfed by it. And many people will say that when they enter that light, it's a type of love that's immeasurable. It's a type of love that's incomparable to any love that they've ever felt on this planet. Religious people will call it heaven. Very often, these people will talk about seeing deceased relatives, deceased friends. They will also have what's called commonly a life review, right? A review of their lives, things that they totally forgot about, but it's coming up to them. And there's a lot of meaning and message behind these life reviews. It typically focuses on the relationships a person had with someone, whether it was good or bad. And the interesting thing about a life review is you're not only seeing it from your perspective, these people have the ability to see it from the other person's perspective. So if you hit someone with a rock, you know exactly what they felt like, and vice versa. Very often they're met by, as I said, a loved one who's deceased, and they will tell them, look, it's not your time. And usually they're shifted right back into their body, and they wake up. And over time, they have these amazing after effects where they change the way they lived. They might change their professions. They may have been very money-minded. Now they're all about non-for-profits and going out and helping and doing charity to everyone. So the experience itself is very life-changing.
As a fan of your podcast, I also noticed that an after effect of coming back to life, so to speak, is they have this, and when I say they, I'm talking about the different variety of people he has interviewed. They have this different like elevated compassion for
Correct.
people.
Yes. It's all about humanity. It's all about planet Earth. It's all about every living being. Even a blade of grass
Yeah.
has meaning to them.
And I think it's just amazing. You've interviewed men, you've interviewed women, different ethnicities, races, different religions. I mean, you can check it out for yourself. And they're all saying a lot of the similar things.
Correct. Dr. Raymond Moody, the one who coined the term near-death experience, wrote a book in 1975 called Life After Life. The subtitle was The Similarity of Experiences, and that's exactly what you see when you listen to these experiences. If you put 10 near-death experiencers in a room, they may all tell you that they had a life review. It's tailored to their individual lives because they didn't live the same lives, but they're all having a life review. Many of them are going into the light. They're saying that this light not only shows them absolute love, immeasurable love, but they'll tell you that this light has a personality. Many people call it a higher power. Many people call it God, right? Atheists have even been in this particular light. People who had no religious belief systems, who had no concept of a God or an afterlife, but they're saying the exact same thing a theist would say. So again, we talked about diversity, right? We talk about diverse clientele. That's exactly what my show is all about, getting people on from diverse backgrounds who've had the same experience and experienced these near-death experiences.
What made you get into that specific niche?
Well, I have always been interested in religion and spirituality, but I'll tell you a quick story. When I was in grammar school, school number 3, we went to together, right? My 4th grade teacher came to the front of the class, and she had talked about a classmate's mother who had went into surgery. He wasn't there that day, but she was talking about how they lost her on the table. They got her back in a few minutes. When she awoke, she talked about being in this beautiful place that was filled with light. There were birds flying all over the place. There was just absolute love. It was pure perfection. And when she said that, in my brain, I was a cultural Christian at the time. We were going to church here and there. And I said, wow, the pastors are right. There is a heaven. Fast forward to when I was 12 years old, I was helping a nun rearrange her bookshelf before school started, and in a place called the Learning Center right in the village where I lived in. I happened to pull out this one book. It's something about what happens after death. And I said, oh, that's interesting. So I opened the book. First page, I read the first line, never forget what I read. It said, and I was moving quickly through this dark tunnel. I shut the book at the time, threw it right back inside of the shelf, and I was like, the pastor was right. There is a hell. But later on, I actually realized that tunnel, which I talked about in the introduction of this conversation, is just a connection from the earthly realm into that transmaterial realm. And in my course of being interested in religion and spirituality over the years, with the advent of the internet, I came into contact with Dr. Raymond Moody's book, and it reminded me of that 4th grade and that 12-year-old experience. I said, oh yeah, I remember these. So I read his book, fascinated. He gave me everything I needed to learn, and I decided, you know what, I think I want to go out and start interviewing people. And so in the year 2020, the Real Spiritual Talk podcast was born. And if you remember, that was around COVID when everything was shut down. So we had things to do at home,
That's great. And as I like to say, as I'm landing the plane, got a few more questions for you.
Sure.
How has your studies of psychology, personal development, and spirituality, how has that impacted your view on life and death and religion and spirituality?
That's a great question. The modern definition of psychology is the study of the mind and the study of behavior. The ancient meaning of psyche or psychology was the study of the self, the study of the soul, right? So when you talk about near-death experience, when you talk about psychology, what I do from a professional standpoint, I'm studying the mind and behavior. But when I do this podcast, I'm studying the self and the soul, right? These people, they're coming out of their physical body, right? It's the belief that there's a spirit or a soul that's detaching from the physical body. And when they come back from the experience, they're really learning about themselves, right? The self. They're like, wait a minute, I'm more than just flesh and blood. I'm more than just a mother and a father, I'm a spiritual entity who should really be caring about humanity rather than just myself, So it's impacting me in a way that I even, if you look at the description of my show at the very end, I say that this show is actually a nexus between spirituality and developmental psychology, because a lot of times the people, they will tell me about life experiences that were very negative or positive before they had their near-death experience, and how they came back and they see life totally differently now. You know, some of them had really bad developments growing up. Some of them have been abused. Some of them have been cheated on. Some of them were victims of attempted murder. That's how they had their near-death experience. But when they come back, they have a whole new understanding of life, the self, and the concept of the soul.
So how has that affected you as an individual?
It's affected me because now I can see life kind of through their eyes based on their firsthand accounts, right? Now I'm looking at humanity differently. I'm like, oh, you know what? Maybe I should be nicer. Maybe I should be kinder. Maybe I should provide more charity. You know, if that's what you came back from heaven with, that's what I think I need to be doing. You know what I mean?
I love that. I love that. Do you have a favorite book? I know you've studied it and you're very well read.
Mm-hmm.
What's your favorite book and why?
I would have to say Life After Life by Dr. Moody is up there. I have a lot of favorite books, but that one right there was just such a classic study of what happens during the near-death experience. And I don't think many books have matched it since then. That's like the Bible of near-death experiences. You always go back to the classics, which is Life After Life. Again, the after effects are so strong. It really helps us dictate how we need to improve our lives, right? Kudos to the person who doesn't have a near-death experience but knows this stuff. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I could tell you as someone who has experienced nothing like crazy like that, right? And for lack of a better word, I'm saying crazy. But as someone who has been in some dangerous situations where things could have really went wrong, immediately what I have experienced is like a sense of gratitude. Gratitude for life, gratitude for the people around me.
Yes.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. And kudos to you for that, because a lot of people don't even see life from that perspective. It takes a near-death experience for them to actually see, wait a minute, there is purpose, there is meaning, you know?
Yeah.
So kudos to the person who says, you know, there's purpose and meaning. And I do see that in you greatly.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I really strive to live life from an intentional perspective and purpose, and why I've been through a lot, you know. So last question, speaking about life and death, what would you want to be known for?
I think I want to be known for someone who put out information to the populace that actually benefited them in a positive way. I really believe nowadays in planting good seeds, right, in the earth. There's a lot of people, you know, unfortunately, that have planted seeds of division. We see that today politically, whether it be political division, whether it be religious division. And I was part of that religious division at one point. I used to believe that, you know, it was my way or the highway. God loves me and he hates the rest of the world. I realize none of that is that's far from the truth. So I want people to recognize me as someone who's planted good seeds in the world. And when I'm long gone, you can still eat off my tree.
I love that, man. And, you know, I want to tell you, as a friend of yours since kindergarten, and just as a journalist, I'm truly inspired by what you represent, the work that you have done as a professional, and also, you know, the plan A. Yes. That didn't work out, you know, just because you've been in radio since the early 2000s. And here I am, you know, with my own podcast. And I remember being a guest on your podcast in 2008.
Yep.
So just want to say, man, I'm truly inspired by also just the man that you turned out to be, man. You're truly a leader, bro. And I can tell you, because I remember being concerned about the way I dress, or, you know, being cool and falling into some of the traps that are unfortunate in the community we come from. And you didn't, bro. You know, you've always been very consistent with who you are.
Thank you.
And I'm super proud of you, man. And I just wanted to salute you for being that type of man.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that very much. And I salute you as well for your journey and what you're trying to do here today. And always, you know, I definitely see, like I said, you're one of those people who didn't have a near-death experience, but you get it, you know, you get humanity, you get how it's better to plant those good seeds rather than to plant those seeds of division.
Absolutely. So now tell the people where they can find your work.
Absolutely. So you can find near-death experience interviews that I conduct on the Real Spiritual Talk Radio podcast on YouTube. Just type in Real Spiritual Talk Radio. You can also type in Real Spiritual Talk Radio on any of the podcast platforms, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Apple Podcasts, etc.
Indeed. What if somebody who has an issue with their child, some ADHD, autism, can they hire you for your services, or how does that work?
Well, I would tell them to first get the child evaluated, right? Go through your GP, who most likely will give you a referral to a neurologist. Once you get a diagnosis, there are a plethora of ABA agencies out there that are willing to work with your child, depending on the needs. Most of them take medical insurance, so nothing is out of pocket. And if I'm working for that agency, you may see me at your front door.
Let's get it. Tell a friend to tell a friend. If you know anyone that could benefit from this conversation, maybe their child has some delays, or maybe are concerned about the development of their child, their behavior issues, send them this episode. If you think it'll benefit them in a productive way, please don't hesitate to share this episode with them. Don't forget to subscribe. Let's get it.